Stop me if you've heard this pitch for a game before. An evil force has taken over the government, society, or some other organization we arbitrarily give the monopoly of violence to and is now using that power to commit violence against innocent civilians in the world. You play as a hero either because they stumble into this or have an active, seething hatred of the New Order, joins the rebellion to overthrow said power. You might be fighting for a cause, a concept, or simply to advance your own ends. To this end, you do a stab, a shoot, a couple extrajudicial murders, and make progress towards overthrowing the evil force. Congratulations, you are a revolutionary. A lot of conventional video game wisdom and story writing tropes, however, undercut this revolutionary atmosphere. A revolution is a natural place for a video game to take place in. Guns are everywhere, you can kill a lot of enemies without remorse, and the oh-so-beloved run-down, grey and brown aesthetic action games have been addicted to for the last 20-odd years is commonplace. However, I think this can be brought into a discussion about how those revolutions are depicted. This isn't an ideological gripe, nor am I really criticizing the games I bring up. They're games I paid good money for and got a lot of enjoyment out of, and this game shouldn't be seen as an attempt to cancel and shame. I just think the discussion of video games and revolutions is interesting, you feel? I'm also going to be focusing largely on AAA or larger studio-produced games because I feel they have a more interesting set of expectations and unwillingness to experiment as compared to indie games. So with that out of the way, let's start. In Tsarist Russia, there was a group called the People's Will. They were called the People's Will. In the late 19th century, they advocated what was known as propaganda by deed, a revolutionary tactic intended to inspire people by showing them they were stronger than they knew, that the autocrats and dictators over them were not immortal, and that regular people could in fact cause great change. They did this by blowing up the Tsar, Alexander, not Nicholas, that would be for Lenin. The logic was basically that by showing people in society they could rise up, they would rise up, and that this revolutionary tactic worked to create power vacuums people would naturally want to fill. These actions were extreme and resulted in mass crackdowns and didn't result in the revolution they had hoped to create. It's not hard to see why either. They were not particularly concerned with creating the vacuums they had filled, and they were instead filled by a state which, while definitely wounded by such attacks, had methods of recovering. It's not like Russia collapsed each time a Tsar died, after all. In essence, individual, violent acts do not compel systemic change most of the time. It's up to mass movements to create mass change. The reason I bring these folks up is because the logic of the propaganda of the deed is more or less the exact same logic a lot of video game revolutions use, destabilizing the power structure through bold actions that a small group of committed people undertake, sometimes with an explicitly stated goal of bringing about change and revolution by showing people they can rise up. Through this, the revolution in a video game is often avatarized as the player character, without whom the revolutionary group is utterly incapable of acting effectively. Dishonored, for example, places you as the sole meaningful, capable figure who can actually do anything. Without the actions of Corvo, literally nothing else can happen. In fact, Dishonored doesn't even represent social unrest that often. Even though there are mass amounts of starvation and the rich are eating like kings, there's very little mention of civilians who might be discontent with the current situation. They're almost all gangsters or corpses. I almost have to wonder what you're fighting for. Between the empty streets and the vast piles of bodies, there doesn't seem to be a citizenry to save. Even if Emily is alive, who does she rule over? These nerds? Of course, while Dishonored doesn't frame it in the same way as the People's Will folk did, it's still a pretty apparent take out the baddies and the government will change ploy. It works out pretty well in the game. All without the citizens have done while really having any control over their own situation. It's just secret cabals of people fighting each other. One of my favorite video game series, Wolfenstein, falls into this as well. Many other video essays have praised the game for its various incredible story beats and features. And I'll link to some of my favorite down in the description because, holy shit you guys, these games are really good. But at least in the first game, there's still this sense that your main character is the person who makes everything possible. Blazkowicz is the person without whom the revolution couldn't work, couldn't really do anything. In the space of weeks, it goes from an underground cell in Berlin to the moon and beyond, striking a series of vicious blows against the Nazi regime. Then you have something like Far Cry 4, can single-handedly save an entire revolution in a matter of weeks, murder a king, utterly rout their forces all by yourself, even though you're very explicitly a tourist. I won't go into detail about that game specifically because I intend to make a whole video on it. I absolutely love 2 of the games that I brought up so far, but it all just raises a question for me personally. When most examples of revolution I can think of fundamentally end up ignoring the people you're supposed to be acting to save, what does this say about the perception of revolutions in video games? Every successful real-life revolution has had popular support, millions of actors, and even if it had a centralized leader, without their support and without the thousands of individuals who are unnamed by history, they could have never gone where they went. And that's where conventional gaming wisdom falls short. So this disconnect where people are ignored in revolutions in games where mass movements don't really exist comes as a consequence of game design focusing around a single person, affected by level design and mechanics far more than narrative. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just a constraint that's been placed on games by what sells and what works in this current market. You know, this is the world of first-person shooters and action-adventures all personified with a player character. This, combined with the general trend towards games letting players feel empowered and a general disdain for experiences of powerlessness, leads to a lot of video games being about a single strong protagonist who, within the limits of the mechanics of the game, can do just about anything. This is standard AAA practice and a very fun setup. However, it is also a very challenging format in which to discuss a social movement, by mere fact that, like I said, every revolution and every social movement is larger than its leaders and the traditionally discussed movers and shakers. A revolutionary without supports of thousands of others is just a theorist, and a mass popular movement without cohesion is very often impotent. I think the traditional way of pop historiography, in which people focus on the greats and powerfuls and those who wrote tomes about their theory, has helped create a perception where it's just a single person who exists as the conduit for a revolutionary social movement. A sort of great man theory in which sometimes certain great people simply emerge from tumultuous times as icons to lead the unwashed masses to a new vision. In each of the examples I've named so far, you are that great man and often achieve what you do without much participation from others, like a force of history and nature itself coming to change the world. There's some variation. Wolfenstein and Dishonored both have rebel groups that support and surround you, while games such as the aforementioned Far Cry lets you hire on help, and a video game like Homefront, outside being the modern-day Red Dawn sans being actually entertaining while high, avenge me! Avenge me! Incorporates your struggle in the world and grounds it in a struggle much larger than yourself, even if you're still a member of a professional revolutionary cadre that ultimately fights for the people while remaining apart. Homefront does do a few needle things here and there, but it's also a shitty game and a really bad series, and I can only give it props for letting me commit war crimes in the truly American icon of Hooters. I would also talk about Just Cause here, where you kind of play as a one-man revolution in service of the not CIA, but I've already put a lot of my points from the article The Complicated History of Revolutions in Video Games by Alex Avard, so I think that copying that point by point is probably unwise. Link in the description, read it. I also think the other examples show the trend better, though the CIA has been involved in a lot of attempts to liberate people from their duly and legally elected governments, and Just Cause is definitely worth analyzing through that lens. Maybe another video. Anyways, I think all this represents one of the great struggles that video game writing, and perhaps all writing, has. They all sort of fall into a great man style of storytelling that clashes very hard with creating a spirit and atmosphere of social change, and undermines the idea that you're actually part of a struggle. When I can fell 100 soldiers by myself, I don't feel like I'm in a pitched battle against overwhelming force. I feel like a badass hero. I'm not struggling, I'm not fighting for my life, I am dominating, destroying the unholy wrath of oppressed people made manifest. I think this is because video games have not really embraced the idea of a sociological story. Sociological storytelling is in a nutshell when stories are driven by the forces of the world they are within. Characters are pushed and pulled back against wide-ranging social forces much larger than they are. While their impacts can be pretty good, ultimately the social factors play as much of a role as any individual actor, if not far more. This form of storytelling is pretty hard to reconcile with the ultra-power fantasy most AAA games present. It's a form of storytelling that inherently removes some agency from the characters, and it's really hard to have something like this while also reflecting the harsh reality that sometimes there are forces beyond your control that will subvert, destroy, or empower your actions completely independent of you. None of this is to say it's a bad thing to have a game that uses a revolution as a staging ground for that sort of thing, but when you're basing your game around the idea that this is a revolution, it's always going to be undermined if you're not willing to take a bit of agency away from the player. It's always going to be undermined and feel less like a revolution and more like a romp through a standard FPS game that we've all seen before. So why aren't there more games that adopt that style of storytelling? You know, there's no RTSs I can think of, there's no survival horrors, there's like 1 or 2 particularly well-written FPSs that focus on the struggles across the world. Why have so few broached this topic with the intent to depict the movement honestly? Because it's really damn hard to do. Most gamers don't like feeling like they're not in control. I think everyone can name a game they've played where the game railroads them, takes their stuff away, or throws in a massive twist that throws the story into disarray, and being, quite justifiably, frustrated by that. It's hard to successfully channel negative feelings in some video game genres, specifically because those genres have the expectation of being power fantasies. This isn't the only problem though, like let's be honest, most big studios don't center the narrative. It is a lot of work to make a game, and if you really care about the story with no regard for mechanics, there's visual novels. But most games therefore follow a cookie cutter plot where you can basically predict what's going to happen. There might be a low point, but more often than not, you get to keep all your fancy toys. Treating these as conventional stories has a lot of issues and can cause a lot of problems. There's always going to be a distinct difference between writing narrative in video games and writing narrative anywhere else, because gamers tend to feel more personal frustration when a story goes south or a character picks up the idiot ball, as compared to, say, a moviegoer or a reader. Particularly when the rest of the game is almost always going to be about showing off your skill and competency. Since this is the case, a conventional narrative where things can go off the rail because of something that has no input from the consumer doesn't land as well. Disempowerment in video games is powerful, removing agency is powerful, and most of all, frustration is an incredibly powerful feeling. I think the feeling of overcoming struggles by games like Dark Souls, video coming eventually, feels so good and so bad at the same time. It's a difficult feeling to pull off in the best of times, and by proposing a more sociological model of storytelling where not everything is in the control of the player, that's only going to be a little harder. Personally, I think a cool direction to go might be survival horror, a partisan or a soldier within a resistance force where the enemy they're rebelling against is better armed, better trained, tougher, and so forth. Keep tension high and predictability low, make you scrounge for ammunition or hope for unreliable supply lines. Make it scary, uncomfortable, and at times, hopeless. Indie games and smaller studios have a hell of a lot more room to explore those sorts of emotions, and particularly to center a narrative more firmly in the story. You know, when you're not beholden to constantly increasing quarterly profits and pumping out a new game every single year, you have more room to experiment. This War of Mine, for example, is a game without very clear antagonists or protagonists, just people in a bad situation being affected by it and being forced to make choices. It's not about a revolution, but it's about a very large social upheaval where you still feel small and unimportant in a much larger event. There's also a game like Tonight We Riot, which specifically centers revolution and uses its playing mechanics in order to emphasize the idea that it's not just one person. It straight up doesn't have a main player character, instead using mobs of revolutionaries with one holding a flag and others picking it back up once any one individual falls. So, you know, that's probably where you go to look for these sorts of stories. There could always be more. I didn't focus on every indie game because I felt these bigger budget productions handle the topics in a more interesting way and frankly hit a bigger audience, so they tell us more about how revolution is normally seen as a story topic. So that's why I didn't focus on these games that I'm now praising. Don't pillory me for it. All of this is to say that larger game studios have a lot of problems depicting movements that require more nuance and experimentation than simple black and white storytelling. They have a lot of problems depicting stories that don't center around your singular, nearly godlike avatar, and as a result, a video game trying to depict a movement that is inherently larger than any one individual will probably fall into some weird dissonance. You know, it's strange. It's almost like the huge AAA industry that makes billions off of introducing gambling to children and overworking their employees to the bone wouldn't be the best place for stories about mass social movements and change. Who'da thunk it? Thank you for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons who are scrolling by right now. They are the ones supporting me and my channel, and I really, really appreciate each and every one of them. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe as well. I've also been getting a lot more subscribers recently as a result of my Warhammer 40k and TNO videos, and I just want to say I appreciate everyone who's subscribed since then. You all make this stuff worth doing. Having an audience makes this kind of work much, much easier to do. Thank you.